Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this colloquy has gone pretty far afield. I don't think it merits response. I'll ask for the vote.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cruz?
Yes.
Welcome. Proceed.
Mr. Chairman, in 1964, Ronald Reagan gave what is now an immortal speech called A Time for Choosing. I think on this committee, we find ourselves similarly in a time for choosing. The senator from Connecticut is trying valiantly to rehabilitate this nominee. And the arguments he's presenting are essentially, well, she's not all that bright. She didn't really read the letter. She didn't really know what was in it. She signed it, but she didn't mean to sign it. And if she'd known what was in it, she wouldn't have signed it. Now, that's the defense of her. Remember, we're talking about whether this person is fit to be a federal judge. And if the best defense is she's too dumb to figure out what she signed and she didn't mean to sign it, didn't read it, and didn't know what it said, that doesn't give you a whole lot of comfort, the kind of job she'd do if she's wearing a black robe and signing death warrants. Maybe she ought to read the piece of paper in front of her. And by the way, this is not some writing from 30 years ago when she was in college. This was written March 16th, 2020, 3 years ago. It's recent. I don't believe it's an accident that she didn't turn it over. She knew damn well this is a radical document. And look, the notion that she did not understand what it meant, I'm holding it in my hand. Let me read you. I'm just going to read you from the very beginning, because let's see if it's subtle. Let's see if they hide the ball, what it talks about. Here are the opening words of the letter. The undersigned organizations and individuals call on Governor Lamont to act immediately to protect the lives of the incarcerated people in our state. 3 urgent steps are needed. 1, the immediate release of as many people in custody as possible. 2, a moratorium on new admissions into jails and prisons. And 3, evidence-based, humane, and and rights-affirming measures to protect the health and well-being of the individuals who will stay behind walls. That's the opening paragraph. It ain't subtle. To my friend from Connecticut, if she's not bright enough to figure out this letter is saying, let the criminals go, when it says in the opening paragraph, we demand right now you let the criminals go, then she needs to go back to remedial English in 5th grade and not become a federal judge. By the way, the letter goes on and on and on. You go into the body of the letter. We call on Governor Lamont, the state of Connecticut, to 1, immediately release, to the maximum extent possible, people incarcerated pre-trial and post-conviction. On pretrial release, here's what it says. Governor Lamont should use his emergency powers to protect incarcerated people, their communities, and correctional staff by releasing all, ALL, all people who are incarcerated without having been convicted of a crime. I want you to stop and understand what those words mean. All people means everyone. It means every murderer in the state of Texas. If you have a serial killer who has raped and murdered a dozen women on the highways of Connecticut and he's arrested, what did this woman call for? Let him go. If it's pre-conviction, let the serial killer go. If you have an aggravated rapist, if you have a child molester, there's no conditionality about, well, only nonviolent. No, it doesn't say nonviolent. It says all. Let every single criminal go pre-conviction. Look, I understand this is Washington, D.C., and there's politics here. And there are a lot of issues on which Democrats vote with Democrats, Republicans vote with Republicans. We've all been here a long time. We understand that's how it works. But every person sitting at this dais was elected by the people of their states. And you were elected not to follow the instructions of Chuck Schumer, not to follow the instructions of Joe Biden. You were elected to represent the citizens of your own states. I've been to the states of every member of this committee. I promise you the citizens of your state would find this a simple question. I expect in a minute every Democrat, like the Soviet Politburo, is going to vote for this judge. Because that's what happens. You're not going to refute the substance of what we said. You're just going to be, we're Democrats, we're voting yes. And part of the reason you are is you're very confident the media back home is not going to ask you about it. I would challenge the Democrat members of this committee. Go home and convene a town hall in your state. Ask the citizens of Illinois, should we confirm to the federal bench a woman who demanded that Connecticut release all violent criminals, all criminals pre-conviction, all murderers, all rapists, all child molesters? Should we make her a federal judge with the power to do that? Ask the citizens of Rhode Island. Ask the citizens of Minnesota. Ask the citizens of Delaware and Connecticut and Hawaii and New Jersey and California and Georgia and Vermont and California again. I guarantee you, I don't care how blue your state is. Your citizens, if you ask them, so what do you think? Someone who thinks we should empty the jails and release violent criminals, should they be a federal judge? Great state of Georgia, the Peach State. I don't think you could find a room of people who would say, yeah, that should be a federal judge. Just about anybody. You can get a bunch of lefty college kids. Ask them, should that be a federal judge? They'd say, of course not. Constitution gives this body the power of advice and consent. But it only works if people have the backbone to use it. If you view your job as I'm a rubber stamp for the Biden White House, whoever they send us, look, the Democrats on this committee have already signed off on 3 nominees of the Department of Justice who want to abolish the police. You've already signed off on a radical judge who describes himself in his own words as a, quote, wild-eyed liberal, says he wakes up every morning motivated by hatred for conservatives. He's a federal judge in New York. God help you if you're a conservative and you're in his court. You go sit there, Your Honor, you realize Your Honor woke up that morning motivated by hatred of you. But every Democrat thought that was fine. That looks like a good judge to us. And you're preparing to move forward on a judge that literally doesn't know what Article 2 of the Constitution is. We've also got another judge whose most significant legal experience was a driver's license revocation proceeding. You all know this is garbage. You know the right thing to do. What it takes is one Democrat to have the gumption to say no. And by the way, all right, y'all are familiar with the little bracelets people wear, WWJD, what would Jesus do? I'm going to suggest to the Democrats you have a version of that. And with respect to the good Lord, I'm not going to invoke his name. I'm going to make a more terrestrial version. I'm going to suggest that you guys wear a bracelet that says WWJKD. That when you're thinking of what to do, ask yourself, what would John Kennedy do? That's a really good test. What would John Kennedy do? And by the way, if these were Trump judges, heck, I'd be here with popcorn watching John Kennedy rip those Trump judges a new one. If they send a judge that doesn't know what Article 2 is, that person's not becoming a judge. Because John Kennedy actually respects what it means to be a judge. He spent too much time in too many courtrooms to know if you have a jackass who doesn't know what he's doing or an ideologue on the bench, it's bad for the rule of law. And y'all remember, John Kennedy torpedoed Trump judge after Trump judge. We had a lot of great judges, but we had some that weren't great. And the ones that weren't great, the Republicans on this committee said, no, go back and do it again. Is there even a single Democrat who could look at that bracelet, what would John Kennedy do, and say, you know what? A judge who calls for releasing every violent criminal in the state of Connecticut who's on pretrial containment, that shouldn't be a judge. You all know it. The choice you're facing is, well, if I vote no, wow, the White House is going to be really mad. If I vote no, Chuck Schumer is going to be really mad. You know, I'm supposed to follow the instructions of my party. You're United States senators, for Pete's sakes. You don't represent the White House. You don't represent Chuck Schumer. You represent the people in your state. And all of you, the people in your state on this nominee, would look to you and say, if they read this letter, the people in your state would say, when you are voting, you should not just vote no, you should vote hell no. I hope and pray maybe one of you chooses to listen to the people in your state, or if not, you can look forward to when you're back in your state, having constituents read this letter to you and say, why did you think this person should be a judge? I got to tell you, I wouldn't know how to answer that question. Only answer I'd know to give to my constituents is, of course I didn't. She'd make a terrible judge. So do what you know is right.
Well, that is the next nominee, and you are recognized.
And I thank you for that. I have made it clear that I will not support this nomination, and there is a good reason for not supporting him, Mr. Chairman. The White House really does not have a good record when it comes to this seat. Back in February, I voiced my opposition to Mr. Delaney, Michael Delaney, who was nominated for this very same seat. Well, Mr. Delaney, we found out, had used hardball tactics against a 15-year-old survivor of sexual assault. He did this in order to protect an elite private school that wanted to cover up the disgusting conduct that had been perpetrated against this young woman. Now, Mr. Delaney threatened to name, to shame, and to humiliate her by removing her anonymity if she had the audacity to come forward and tell her story. Now, fortunately, at least one of my Democratic colleagues had the moral clarity to join us in sinking Mr. Delaney's nomination. Now, after the Delaney debacle, you would think that the White House would have learned their lesson. And I thought they would have the decency to nominate someone who actually had a track record of protecting women and children, and it seems I was wrong. The president has chosen to nominate someone very similar to Mr. Delaney and his disregard for the well-being of children, and that is Seth Aframe. And I recently spoke on the Senate floor about this nomination, so I'd like to walk my colleagues through the two cases that Mr. Aframe prosecuted that automatically, in my opinion, automatically disqualify him from service on the federal bench. Now, in each of these two cases, Mr. Aframe recommended sentences far lower than the guidelines for heinous, unimaginable crimes against children. One of the defendants was guilty of unconscionable acts of sexual violence against a 14-year-old girl with a hearing impairment. This precious child was kidnapped. She was taken to an abandoned motel in Vermont, and she was raped. Despite all of this, despite what happened to this child, Mr. Aframe, as the prosecutor in this case, recommended a sentence far below the probation officer's suggested guidelines. It is clear that Mr. Aframe wanted a low sentence. And let me read you why. And these are his words. He wrote, and I'm quoting, This low sentence will incapacitate the defendant until he is in his 60s. Hopefully, by that time, the danger that the defendant presents will have subsided. End quote. Mr. Chairman, that is repulsive. It is disgusting. And you have a 14-year-old girl that was hearing impaired that was forced to go through this rape and this sexual violence with a man, and then you've got a judge who says, well, maybe by the time he's in his 60s, he will not want to do that anymore. That is disqualifying from someone to sit on the federal bench. What is a woman? What is a girl? What are they going to think when they go before this man? Now, the other case that I want to bring up, the defendant in the other case had created 6 videos of himself sexually abusing a 3-year-old girl. 3 years old. Now, many of us are parents and grandparents. I want you to think about this. Think about a 3-year-old girl being sexually abused, not once, not twice, not 3, not 4, not 5, 6 different times. 6. Think about this. This is a 3-year-old toddler. How many of you have 3-year-olds in your lives? I do. To me, this is repulsive. So let's talk about the sentence in this case. Well, Mr. Ephraim decided he was going to recommend 60 years, but what was the sentencing guideline on this? It was life in prison. If he had given him life in prison, he wasn't going anywhere. He was locked up. 60 years, well, maybe the guy can get probation. So Mr. Ephraim himself noted in the sentencing memo that he was asking for something lower than life in prison. When I pressed Mr. Ephraim about this under oath, on why he refused to recommend life in prison, he misrepresented the facts. So let me again set the record straight. The sentencing memo that Mr. Ephraim wrote himself stated that the guidelines recommend a sentence of life in prison for raping this child. That, Mr. Chairman, is a fact. Regardless of what your staff is whispering in your ears, that is a fact. So I am going to ask my Democratic colleagues to join me in voting no on Seth Ephraim. The man is morally unfit to sit on the federal bench.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kennedy.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Russell sent a letter to the governor of Connecticut during the pandemic. Here's what she said, quote, "As they stand, prisons and jails are detrimental to public health and human rights and disproportionately harm marginalized communities, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color, immigrants, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who use drugs, people engaged in sex work and street economies, and people experiencing houselessness and poverty. Then she went on to request the governor to immediately release everybody in jail in Connecticut. It's unclear to me whether she was talking about just during the pandemic or on a permanent basis. Then she goes on to tell the governor of Connecticut to stop putting people in jail. And it's still unclear to me whether she meant just for the duration of the pandemic or on an extended basis. And on top of all of that, the cherry on top, she didn't turn the letter over to the committee. I don't know why she didn't. Perhaps she thought, I'm not saying this is the case, she thought we wouldn't find it. It took about 7.3 minutes on Google to find it. Now, this is America. Ms. Russell has a constitutional right to believe in these things and to say those things. She does not have a constitutional right to be a federal judge. And she's not qualified to be a federal judge if those are her beliefs. How can she possibly, how can any criminal defendant in front of her or any prosecutor in front of her think that they're getting a fair shake in light of this letter when she sentences someone to prison, if she ever does sentence someone to prison? It's just simply breathtaking. And for that reason, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be voting no.
Mr.
Anyone
Chairman.
else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank my colleagues on the other side for those comments, which really don't call into question the fundamental credentials and qualifications of this nominee, which are extraordinary. As to the letter, Senator Kennedy, those are not her beliefs. In fact, in response to questions raised during her hearing, she stated in a supplemental statement, and I'm going to quote her, "The letter does not accurately reflect my views. In particular, the letter's suggestions were overbroad and failed to make expressly clear that all decisions about whether to incarcerate people and whether to release people who are already incarcerated must be conducted in a manner consistent with the law and public safety of people and communities." She goes on to cite the specific statutes that would have to be followed by her as a district judge in sentencing or in releasing someone. And she also expresses regret for failing to submit that letter, acknowledging that it should have been. She made a mistake, and she acknowledges it. I think that the views expressed in that letter, which was signed by hundreds, it was a mass letter, not written by her alone. She has, in effect, disowned, saying that they are stated too broadly. And I would urge my colleagues to look to the qualifications of this nominee, which are extraordinarily
Would the
distinguished.
senator yield for a question?
Mr. Chairman, my name was invoked. Can I respond just quickly?
Senator Kennedy?
I appreciate Senator Blumenthal's comments. But Richard, here's how I see it. She got caught. She got caught. She had an epiphany once she got caught. And I am looking at her qualifications, and I am looking at her record. And I don't know that she didn't help write this letter. I know she signed it, and I know she tried to hide it from this committee. So even if you agree with her that we should stop, that actions have no consequences, and that nobody's ever responsible anymore, and it's always somebody else's fault when a criminal sodomizes a young girl, and everybody ought to get a trophy. I mean, I wish we lived in a world like that, but that's what she believes. And you know it, and I know it. And she has recanted after she got caught, and she got caught because she didn't turn it over to us, for God's sakes. Senator, we had to find it on our own. Shame on her. And every single time when she has got to, on the federal bench, she has got to sentence a criminal defendant, this is going to be grounds for appeal. For God's sakes, does the rule of law mean nothing?
The
I'm
Senator
sorry,
yield for a
Senator.
question.
Certainly I do, Senator, and I apologize for not yielding.
that's-
Senator.
Chair recognizes Senator Cornyn.
Thank you for yielding for the question. Is the senator from Louisiana familiar with a concept called confirmation conversion? Kind of like a deathbed.
I would like to hear
conversion.
more about it, Senator.
Well, I'd just be interested, how can you reconcile the letter with what Senator Blumenthal, the senator from Connecticut, read as her disavowal of the letter? Did she express regret, or that she had misspoken, or that she now, on second thought, had different ideas? I'm trying to get my head around how do you reconcile this letter that you read from the statement that the senator from Connecticut.
Well, Senator, here's how I reconcile it. 3 words. She got caught. She got caught. And we found the letter. And she didn't turn it over. And during committee, instead of saying, yeah, I signed the letter, and I shouldn't have done it, I don't believe that. First, she said she wasn't sure. And then she was sure. And then she didn't mean it. And then she'll make a pinky promise that she'll be a fair federal judge. These positions are for life. They're there forever. At a minimum, just because you've seen My Cousin Vinny doesn't qualify you to be on the federal bench. At a minimum, there ought to be a minimum level of integrity and a minimum level of adherence to the rule of law. And this lady sets a new standard. And I wish you didn't have to say that, but those are the facts.
Would the senator yield for one last question?
Of course.
Are you familiar with the fact that all federal judges are subject to a code of judicial conduct?
Yes, sir.
That would be all federal judges, correct?
Yes, sir.
Including members of the United States Supreme Court.
Yes, sir.
And is the senator aware of the fact that that code of judicial conduct that applies to all federal judges was actually promulgated in 1919?
Yes, sir. I understand that's the case.
And I'm trying to reconcile the chairman's statement that this code of judicial conduct that applies to the Supreme Court specifically, that was issued on November the 13th, that was the first time that members of the Supreme Court were subject to a code of judicial conduct. Isn't it the fact that the code of judicial conduct that applied to all federal judges applied to them as well?
Yes, sir.
And one of those, how can a litigant, a citizen accused of a crime, somebody who goes to court to seek vindication for a wrong done to them, how can they have any confidence whatsoever in a judge that won't tell the truth?
They can't. And shame on us for allowing someone like that to get on the federal bench.
Now, we've talked a little bit about judicial independence here. I think I agree with those people over time, over the last 230 years or so, who've said that the independence of the judiciary in the United States is a single most distinguishing feature of our form of government. Because ultimately, people are going to be held accountable, and not for political reasons, not because of their unpopular point of view, but because a judge in some court, perhaps with an appeal to an intermediate court and maybe the Supreme Court, has said, you were wrong and the other side was right. But we also said that these judges should be independent of politics. That's why they get lifetime appointments. That's why the Constitution says their salary cannot be diminished while they serve in office. So what recourse does a litigant, a citizen accused of a crime, or the prosecutor who's representing the state or perhaps the United States, what recourse do they have against somebody who's confirmed as a federal judge who won't tell the truth?
It's a mystery to me, and we're creating a real problem here, in my opinion, Senator. And a real problem for the efficient operation of our court. I mean, if I'm a criminal defendant or a criminal defense attorney, I'm going to do everything I can to try to get this lady as my judge. And if I'm a prosecutor, I'm going to try to avoid her, and I think this letter may very well be grounds for appeal in every single solitary case. I mean, she says it here, big as Dallas. I don't believe in putting people in jail. If they're part of this particular group that she deems virtuous. Now, if you're not in her group of people that she deems underprivileged and virtuous, you're really at risk, apparently. But if you can fit yourself into, if you can somehow become black, brown, indigenous, an immigrant, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who use drugs, if you can convince the judge that you have been engaged in sex work and street economies, or you are homeless or poor, then she thinks you should not be in jail.
I've heard it said that the single most powerful public official in the United States is an individual federal judge. Have you heard that?
Yes, sir. I think that's...
And what recourse does Congress have to a federal judge who blatantly disregards their obligations under the law? Do we have the authority to force them to recuse or disqualify them? Isn't it fact that given the constitutional independence of the judiciary, the sole recourse that Congress has, I'm not talking about the litigants, that Congress would have would be to impeach, for the House to impeach and the Senate to convict them in a court of impeachment. Isn't that right?
That is correct, and that's why I've always been so proud to sit on this committee, because our job is to stop people from getting on the bench who are whack jobs.
And that same limitation of remedy that Congress would have would also apply to a United States Supreme Court justice, correct?
Yes, sir.
Impeachment by the House, conviction in the Senate, and removal from office. That's the sole remedy, correct?
Yes, sir.